Well, welcome everybody to Roundabout Books Thursday Night Author Event Series. My name is Julie and I'm the events manager at Roundabout Books. We have some really fun events coming up in the rest of June and July, as well as the event we're doing right now. And I just wanted to remind everyone that the store is open every day, 10 to 5. We may be extending our hours coming soon as our town lifts some of the COVID restrictions, and we are looking into having some in-person events in the fall that will also be available on Zoom. So if you aren't able to come into the store, we still want you to see these events. So we're going to do a hybrid option. If you haven't picked up the book that we are going to talk about tonight, please give the store a phone call. You can pay for it over the phone. We can ship it to anywhere or leave it out front on our red bench for pickup. So let's go ahead and get started. We are joined tonight by Terence Emmons, who is the author of Pioneering Oregon Architecture, featuring W.D. Pugh. So Terence, based on your bio and something I wanted to mention again, you're a fourth generation Oregonian, which I love. I love people who take pride in their state. You have a degree from the University of Washington and UC Berkeley, and you were a history professor at Stanford, which is so cool. And it looks like you've written a couple other books, but we definitely want to talk about the book tonight because it is so Oregon centered. So the first question I have for you is, what got you interested in this architect and, wanting to write a book about him?
Well, the principal reason I'm interested in this architect is that he was my grandfather. And I knew him as an old man because he was born in 1863, the year of the Emancipation Proclamation in Oregon. And why I got interested in this book is that I knew, as did members of my immediate family, that my grandfather had been an architect, and we knew of a few buildings that he had designed. One of them was the City Hall in Salem, and another was the White Spires Church in Albany, which was located actually right across the street from my father's law office. So we saw it all the time. Although I must say, I found out about the authorship of the architecture only much later when it came time to set up a restoration of the building. And my father asked us to contribute, which we did modestly. And I only then knew about it. As for going into his career and story much more deeply, my son, Joseph, his great-grandson, once suggested, I can't remember exactly why, a few years ago, that we collect our grandchildren when summer vacation comes along. This was the summer of 2019, and visit these places, take a tour up to the Willamette Valley and have a look at them, and tell the grandchildren about them. And in preparation for that little trip, I thought that was a fine idea, by the way, I started looking more deeply with the help of the internet, and especially digitized Oregon newspapers, local newspapers, into his activity as an architect. And I gradually discovered that he had designed many dozens of buildings throughout Oregon, and had built as a contractor. He also was a contractor during his career, buildings as far away as California and Arizona Territory at that time, Arizona Territory. And I eventually came up with a list of about 75, 80. There are a few questionable ones. There may be a few more that I wasn't able to discover. So I decided to get photographs of those buildings, both the built ones and the designed ones, to the extent I could, and then try to figure out the story behind them and why we in the family in particular didn't know about all of this, whether we knew a very little bit about it. And for example, I'll give you one more example before I turn it over to you again. It turns out that my father went to law school at Willamette in the early 1930s in a building that was designed by his father-in-law, that is my grandfather, and he didn't even know that. So that was a sort of mystery that needed to be unraveled. And so there's a story in the book, not just pictures, but a story is about how we discovered all of this and how it all evolved, how he had an architectural career which came rather abruptly to an end, the reader would find out, and so on. That's the reason behind it all.
Yeah, that's very interesting that you make a distinction too, that it's not just an architecture book. It's not just the history of these buildings. It is really the biography of your grandfather and understanding, what he was doing at a time when, this area was still being developed. I mean, we became a state in, is it 1859?
59, yeah.
Yeah. So that's very interesting. So let's talk about the really close to home project, which is the Crook County Courthouse in Prineville. So can you give us a little bit of a background on that one?
Well, I don't have a very clear idea of how he got that job, except that he was by this time, this is 1906 to 8. 1906 to 1908. It was finished in 1908. Except that he was by that time a very well-known Salem architect. He had been involved in the mounting of the cupola on top of the second State House, the one that burned down in 1935. He designed the oldest still existent building on what is now the university, now Oregon State University campus. He had designed buildings in Eugene. So exactly how he came to be known to the fathers of Prineville, who decided to put up this big courthouse, and if you've seen it, you know it's rather majestic thing for the middle of the desert out there, or the middle of the prairie. I'm not quite sure, but he did design it. And you probably have heard this story about the difficulties that ensued. The first contractor who took the job on went bankrupt before he was able to do much more than lay the foundation and the groundwork for it. And then a local town father, who was also a builder, took it over and finished it in 1908. It started in 1905-06. And there was a great deal of controversy about building so great a building at such what was then a considerable cost in rather sparsely populated Central Oregon. And as a matter of fact, the history of that building, not to get away from my grandfather's career as such, is in the history of Central Oregon is quite interesting, because partly as a result of the resolve of the Prineville town fathers who wanted to draw attention to the importance of Prineville, make it the most important city in this part of Oregon, and maybe get the railroad from the Columbia down to California to run through Prineville, raised a lot of objection in other parts of the county. At that time, Crook County was an enormous county which included present-day Crook County, but also Deschutes County, where you are, and Jefferson County, where, what's the capital of Jefferson County? The county seat, Madras.
Madras.
Yep. Madras. And as a result, in a referendum, Jefferson County broke off from Crook County in 1914, I believe, and set up its own county. Deschutes County failed to do this then, but by 1916, they managed, with the help of voters in Prineville, who were hoping to retain it as a county seat, Deschutes County broke off from Crook County. So now you have 3 counties, and they were all connected with the construction of this large courthouse, which is still serving as a courthouse, by the way.
Yeah, it's a lovely building. Every time I go through Prineville to see my dad, I have to drive right past it. So that's very interesting. You know, that's interesting that the county's formed that way. That's not something we learn in our history classes about Oregon at all. I will say this, for whatever happened back then, the counties work very well together right now. There's actually kind of a tri-county, you know, cooperation thing with the COVID vaccines. So if you're a resident of Deschutes County, you can still get it in any of the other counties as long as they have an appointment or, you know, an opening, which I think is a very nice, you know, thing to do for our area. So you mentioned that you took your grandkids, you know, to go see some of these. How many did they get to visit?
Well, they visited the Shelton McMurphy Johnson Victorian Mansion in Eugene, which is presently a museum. They visited the site of the Salem City Hall, which was torn down in 1972, despite a movement to try to stop that from happening. They visited their grandfather's house in Salem. They visited White Spires Church in Albany. And my son and his family later visited the buildings at the campus of Oregon State, which we did not know about at that time. I only found out about that in my research later after our little tour.
So did you intend for this to be a book, or was it more of a passion project, kind of family history project?
No, I intended to be a book once I found out that there was this puzzle to be solved, namely that he had designed or built a great many buildings all around the Northwest and to some extent the Southwest when it comes to contract buildings. We can talk about them as a kind of separate issue, perhaps. And then the family knew almost nothing about it. He left no archive. Most of the buildings he designed, as far as design is concerned, were designed before the existence of city planning commissions or anything like that. So there are no town or city or county archives holding the plans of these things, although I was able to find the original plans on silk, by the way, very detailed, for the Crook County Courthouse in the county clerk's office. They provided me with copies of those, and with some other buildings in Salem that he designed. But that was the extent of archival sources, and so nobody seemed to know about this. So I needed to solve this puzzle, and it seemed the best way to do that was to tell a story. And I put the story together mainly on the basis of what he built, since we don't have a memoir or a diary of him or any of people close to him. I had to tell his story through buildings. I call it a biography, A Life in Buildings is sort of the subtitle of the book, A Life in Buildings.
That's so interesting. When we think of architects now, you know, maybe a few of them have come out as kind of celebrity, you know, they designed this building. Do you have a favorite of the buildings he designed?
Well, I never thought of that question. I would say probably the either the Crook County Courthouse or the Fairview Farm, which was an installation for what was called the epileptic and the feeble-minded, which separated off from the state hospital, which was the insane asylum in Oregon, in Salem, and set up for persons who had those particular maladies, who were, I guess, not considered insane, but disabled.
Mm.
And he designed a whole set of buildings, very nice buildings, which I visited, by the way, before they were torn down when I was a boy. I'd say probably those are my favorites, along with the administration building of Oregon State, which is still in operation. A large number of these buildings are in fact still in existence, and some of them, he designed a number of banks. One bank in particular has been a bank ever since it was created at the beginning of the 20th century, and is still functioning as a bank in Independence, Oregon.
So you touched on a question I wanted to ask, in that, do you have a record, or because it was so hard to find some of these of some of his buildings that have since been demolished?
You mean, do we have photographs of them in particular?
Well, more just, do you know which ones that, you know, were his that maybe aren't around anymore?
Yes, yes, and we had, there are also photographs of many of them, not all, a few that I'd heard about, excuse me. A few that I read about in old newspapers, I could not find photographs of, but there's an excellent collection of digitized historic building photographs available called Building Oregon online, free, where you can find many of these things. But then the Salem Public Library has a large digitized photograph collection. The State Library of Oregon has one, University of Oregon, Oregon State, they all have digitized photograph collections. But there may be some, and most of them that I found out about by reading local newspapers of the time, basically all the way from the 1880s through the 1920s, doing keyword searches, of course. And that turned up a lot of stuff. And then I would go looking for the photograph, and I could find the photograph often, not always, in one of these sources I just mentioned, and put them together. And but there are still a few outstanding items that I read about having been built or designed that I can find no record of. Just a few, not major installations, but a few. Yep.
So you mentioned when your dad went to law school, he didn't realize that building had a connection. When you were doing the research for this, was there a building that you discovered and were surprised to find out? I mean, I guess it's kind of a surprise on all of them, but is there one that maybe you had a lot of interaction with that then you found out he designed?
Well, that may have been one of the more interesting ones, because I thought for years, when I lived in Salem, when we all lived in Salem, that my father went to school, to law school. He also was an undergraduate there, in Gatke Hall, what's known as Gatke Hall, which is still standing and still on campus. It's one of the oldest buildings. And it was actually right across the street from my father's office at the time. He worked for the State Accident Commission. And lo and behold, when I found out that my grandfather had designed this building on campus, and I found a picture of it, began, I should say, as the medical school, the Willamette Medical School. Willamette had the first medical school in the Northwest, and after that was built in 1905. And some years later, the medical school moved to Portland. And I guess because medical schools like to be in big cities where they can find lots of cadavers to teach students with, I'm just guessing. And then they were in Portland, associated with a hospital. I can't remember which one it was, Good Samaritan maybe. And then they had some kind of falling out with the hospital and came back to campus. And that's when they built this building, very nice Renaissance type building, as a medical school. And then after a while, they moved back to Oregon and joined up with the University of Oregon Medical School to form this big medical center that they have up there now, Oregon Health Services, whatever it is.
Yeah.
You know it, I'm sure. And the building that started out as a medical school, between the time of its first move to Portland and its second, was a law school when it was absent in Portland the first time. And that's when my father went to law school there. He went in that building, not in Gatke Hall, which is the present law school, or was until recently the law school at Willamette. So that was a big discovery. Another discovery that I think was interesting was in the old commercial center of Salem, Commercial Street, State Street, down to Chemeketa roughly. He designed a number of buildings in the late 1880s, early 1890s. And there was one of the largest of these buildings, a little section of which still exists, but one of definitely the largest one, almost a block long, a commercial building. He designed, and nobody knew that he had designed it until I made that discovery, or it had been forgotten, I should say. And there's a plaque on this surviving section of the building, which attributes the architecture to someone else. Most likely, I think it says. They're not absolutely sure. So that was a big discovery. There are many other little things like that I enjoyed doing in the process.
That's interesting that, yeah, that it says someone else's name. I just lost my train of thought. During his time, was architecture like a well-paying profession?
I would say not particularly. And this has something, my story involves that issue. I believe that an architect generally receives somewhere around 4 or 5% of the projected net cost of building projects. That was not a whole lot of money, most often. And often they didn't get paid all at once. They had to wait for approval by city councils or by merchants and for completion. Many of these buildings, he was both the architect and the supervisor of construction, not the contractor, but the supervisor of construction. In other words, he had to be around monitoring the thing as it went along. So often it was quite a while before the architect, I presume, got all of his money. Architects, many buildings in Oregon were built without any particular interest in the question of who was the architect. There were professional architects, of course, but especially in Portland, but also elsewhere. And many of these buildings are described in the literature or even in the National Register of Historic Places. And the line where for the form that's filled out in applications for the National Register, the line for architect is often left blank. So it was not a, you said there are now celebrity architects. No, I don't think there were many. There are a few famous architects that emerged that had careers in Portland at one time or another, but very few. And at that time, they were not well known.
Would you say that he was more prolific than others of his time? Because it sounds like, he was involved in a lot of buildings.
I think probably in his heyday from the mid 1880s to 1909, roughly, he was probably the most prolific architect in Oregon, at least outside of Portland. Portland's a sort of separate story because Portland was already a sizable city and so on. And then he became, after, and that's germane to your question about whether they were well paid. Then he, at one point, essentially went over to being a contractor, a building contractor. And he got involved in road paving. When the automobile came along, there was a big rush to pave roads to get the dust down and provide places for these automobiles to go. And he got heavily involved in that. And he built a lot of buildings, for example, as a contractor for the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Oregon, on the coast near Madras, Warm Springs Indians, Indian Reservation. He built buildings there, built buildings in Tucson, in Arizona, in Phoenix, off reservation buildings, rather large number of them. And he built the buildings at Chemawa near Salem, another off reservation school. This was a big area of construction once the Congress had passed a law in 1890, I believe, that it was the federal government's responsibility to provide education to Indian children. And so funds were provided by the Department of Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs, to build buildings for these schools. He was heavily involved in that for a while.
Yeah, okay, very cool. So as a fourth generation Oregonian, that would put your great grandfather or his parents. Do you know what brought your family line to Oregon?
Well, yes. Technically, I think I'm only a third generation because his father, my great grandfather, David Hall Pugh, came to Oregon with a family in typical wagon train from Missouri in 1845 at the age of 11. And his mother, my great grandmother, came to Oregon by way of the Mississippi across the Isthmus of Panama up to the mouth of the Columbia River and up the Columbia River to the Willamette in 1851. So technically I am a third, I guess you would say I'd have to be a third generation, not a fourth generation. His father, David Hall Pugh, however, grew up in Salem and was himself a builder and a kind of architect. I don't think he had any formal training as an architect, but he was known as the designer and builder of a rather famous mansion near the Capitol building, which was torn down, I believe, in the 1830s to make way for the state library later. But that's what happened to it. I've seen photographs of it being dismantled. And but he was a well-known Salem architect and builder. And incidentally, the family's connection with Willamette University began with him. Both he and his future wife, whom he met there, I think, were taking sort of basic education courses. This was before high school education was institutionalized in Oregon at Willamette, which started out as an institute for created by missionaries, at first to teach, to enlighten, let's say. That's what they thought they were doing, Native American children. And then they gradually became a school for teaching the children of pioneers and missionaries and so on from back east. People came from back east. And eventually that became Willamette University. And he and his wife, my great grandmother and great grandfather, both associated as young people with Willamette, just as it was becoming a university.
Wow,
then,
that's some great history of Oregon. So I'm sure you cover this in the book, but I just wanted to ask, did he have a particular style? Is there buildings that you see that you can say you recognize some of the things he was working on, or was he very, it was more specific to the project?
I would say he was not known as a creative architect. He was known for building very, very solid, well finished and well decorated buildings. But he followed traditional models. He built what his patrons wanted. He used a plan book that was well known in architectural circles in those days. He was not an innovator. This is not Frank Lloyd Wright,
right?
But he was very productive and designed a lot of very, very solid buildings. But no, he was not known as a creator. Although there was an outfit in Salem at one time that put out a blog about local history, and they decided that Walter Pugh was enamored of towers. He put towers on almost all of his buildings. But I think that was probably general fashion, nothing peculiar to him.
That's interesting. Well, we have a couple of people attending tonight, and what I'd like to do is go ahead and open it up to them. Any questions you have for our author or about the book, architecture in general. Carol, I know you just joined us. There will be a chance to watch this on YouTube later. But if either of you have questions, please feel free to ask them. Yes,
I do.
Go ahead.
Terry, how did you find out about the planning book? I was surprised to hear you say that your grandfather had a planning book, since there seems to be so little other documentation.
I got a lead to that in the following way. In 1972, when the city of Salem was about to tear down the courthouse, which was a real feature landmark building in Salem. By that time, people had decided it was ugly. It was a great massive brick structure, but had a very nice sort of Venetian tower. I remember it well. My grandmother, his widow, got involved in the movement to try to save the building, or at least the tower. And she was interviewed by the local newspaper, and I got hold of that interview at the 1972 interview. And in it, she mentioned this book, which she said he always had with him. So I looked it up, and of course I found a copy of it online. And I looked at it, and sure enough, there it was. And it was apparently a very well-known guide to architectural styles. It had, a chapter on churches, a chapter on city halls, chapter on residences, chapter on commercial buildings, chapter on banks, and so on. Not details, not great details, but drawings of these things and suggestions about what should be included in them, and so on and so forth. And so sure enough, there was such thing. That's how I found out about it, by reading this interview with my grandmother in a newspaper published in Salem in 1972.
Do we have time for a follow-up question?
Absolutely.
So in your spare time when you weren't writing the book, have you been able to take the time to look through that planning book and see if you recognize any of the buildings, so that you know that your grandfather took the advice of the planning book as a guide?
I would say probably yes, in a general way. I didn't see anything look like an exact copy. But for example, let's take a bank building. This guy who produced this book, it came out and had a second edition. First one was 1859, I think, and the second one about 10 years later. He had some suggestions about bank buildings. They ought to make them look trustworthy, where you want to put your money. So this involved pillars, Grecian pillars, of course, at the entrance. And he liked corner buildings and corner entrances. And in fact, my grandfather, who designed, let's see, four or five bank buildings, all but one of them are corner buildings. The one that still exists in Independence is typical of them. It has a tower too, by the way. The one exception is in Julie's territory in Redmond. It's no longer a bank, but it does have the pillars. There are alongside the inset entrance on one of the street sides. The entrance on that particular building in Redmond is not on the corner. Things like that. Yes, to that degree, I did recognize things, but no exact copy of anything that he did.
Thank you.
Yes,
You're welcome.
thank you for those. Carol, if you had any questions for our author, I can unmute you, or you can type them in the chat. Go ahead.
Well, I missed most of the talk. I'm aware of his book, and I've looked at it, read some of it, but I don't think I have any questions.
Okay.
Especially kind of coming in here at the end.
Well, if you aren't able to find the YouTube link and you want to see it, you can always reach out to our bookstore, and I'd be happy to send it to you directly.
I actually have a copy of it.
Oh, good.
So that's great, yeah. I'm
Thank you.
sorry I missed hearing Terry talk about it, but I did. I was in another meeting and it just ended.
Well, Carol is, I would say, one of the few people that I know have gotten this book who actually seems to have read it, or at least part of it, let's say. I'm getting the impression that most of them think it's basically a picture book, just because there's so many photographs in it, and they don't pay attention to my narrative, which I worked
My
on.
background is real estate, so I'm really interested in buildings and how they get developed, and especially these older buildings, and that we just take them for granted. They're there.
Right.
Yeah,
The
there's definitely some cool
One
buildings
person
in
who
Redmond.
read the book thoroughly, I know. Others may have. I'm not accusing them. I'm not reading them. There's not going to be a test. But one person that I know read the book carefully, was Tammy Wilder, who is a volunteer historian and curator of a small museum in Kaiser, Oregon, where the Pugh family had its original donation land claim, along with a number of other families. And I sent her a copy with thanks for some work she did for me, some help she gave me. And I could tell from her answer that she had actually read the book.
So is there any plans for putting more plaques on these buildings that he worked on where the history has kind of been lost?
Well, I'm going to go to Salem when the COVID has been released entirely and talk to the people who have the building with the plaque on it, which incorrectly attributes the design to another architect. And by the way, I must say that one thing we haven't talked about is, with the exception of the Victorian mansion in Eugene, which is a museum and has been very well maintained, on Skinner Butte, near the center of town, he designed quite a few private residences, and very few of those have survived. And it's very difficult to get either pictures or information about them. Often all I know is that there's a squib in the paper that says the plans for such and such house for so and so are available in Walter Pugh's office.
Okay, yeah. Well, yeah, I hope you do get that plaque corrected, because I think that's, very valuable information to the future generations in Oregon to, understand and know these people that help, change the landscape of what we know. And like I said, the courthouse in Crook County is just, beautiful. I don't have any more questions, and I love that Priscilla asked a few. And again, Carol, thank you for being here. So is there any last tidbits that you want people to know about this book?
Well, I think I mentioned it several times. I want people to know that there's a story there. The photographs I'm very proud of, because the publisher had quite high standards about the quality, that is the number of pixels per square inch, that sort of thing, of the quality of the pictures that I offered as illustrations. And I had a dickens of a time getting those. Sometimes they weren't quite the photograph that I really wanted, but you do what you can. And I must say that the publisher, Arcadia Publishing, which does all these local histories and has a regular branch called the History Project, or the History Editors. They do a very good job. I'm very pleased and content with them. The way they produce the book, I think it looks good. They use good paper. They were very demanding, justly so, on the quality of the photographs and so on.
Yes, I definitely noticed that when we saw the book in the store, and we've worked with them on a couple other events for historical or outdoor books, and they're a really good publisher.
Well, in my experience, they did a fine job.
Yeah. Well, excellent. I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight and talking more about this book. And when we are recommending it to people at the store, we will make sure that they know that there is a wonderful historical narrative along with these wonderful pictures. So again, thank everyone for being here tonight. Thank you so much for supporting independent bookstores, bookstores in general, and also these smaller independent authors. These are the kind of books that we need to have written so that we don't forget the history that's around us. So yeah, please give us a call at the bookstore if you haven't already gotten your copy. And that's all I have.
Thank you for
Thank you
doing
very
this,
much.
Julie. Thanks so much for doing it. And Terry will know when the YouTube is available so we can tell all our friends.
Absolutely. If I don't get it up tonight, it'll go up first thing in the morning and I will email him the link. So yes, please share it with anyone you think would be interested in finding out more about this book.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to sign off. Again, happy reading. Everyone stay safe. And I hope you enjoy the lovely weather this weekend.